And we have a pattern now of mass shootings in this country that has no parallel anywhere else in the world. It is possible that this was terrorist related, but we don't know. It is entirely possible that these two attackers were radicalized to commit this act of terror.
President Obama's evolving reaction this week to the San Bernardino massacre. Tonight, he'll address the nation about how he intends to confront the terror threat. And it's time now for our Sunday group, Fox News senior political analyst Brit Hume, Julie Pace, who covers the White House for the Associated Press, syndicated columnist George Will, and Fox News political analyst Juan Williams. Will, Julie, as soon as you heard that the president was going to be speaking tonight, I'm sure you were busy working your sources at the White House. What do you expect him to say, and is there any chance he'll announce some kind of dramatic change, some dramatic escalation in the war on terror?
To your last question, no, it doesn't sound like there's going to be any kind of major policy announcement, nothing in terms of troop deployments or a major shift in strategy for going after the Islamic State, either abroad or trying to track people who have been radicalized in the U.S. I think that more broadly, this is an attempt by the president to acknowledge that for a lot of Americans, after the attacks in Paris and now in California, that the terror threat feels much more real, much more closer to home than it has previously. So I think that some of this is going to be him talking about it in a way that I think a lot of people had hoped he would have talked about it previously. And also to show that he does take this seriously. The optics of this are important. The president hasn't delivered an Oval Office address to the nation since 2010. He has often kind of eschewed the optics of the job, and this is a way for him to show people visually that he understands that this is something that people are taking very seriously.
To the degree that he was behind the curve of a lot of Americans this week, where he was talking about workplace violence and gun control and seem a lot slower than the average American to come to the conclusion this was an act of terror. Is this a belated effort for him to get ahead of the curve?
It is a bit. I mean, I think that this is part of a pattern with this president. He is often very cautious in his initial statements. He thinks that's the right approach, but you can often see that over the course of a couple of days or a week, the president will typically end up where Americans are and where a lot of his critics, frankly, have wanted him to be from the start.
We ask you for questions for the panel, and we got this on Facebook from Renee Trotter. She writes, "We know that there was a suspicious neighbor who was afraid to call authorities due to fear of being labeled a racist. Similar occurrences happened with Major Hassan before he shot numerous people at Fort Hood." Brit, how do you answer, Renee, when it comes to this issue of political correctness, and what do you expect or hope to hear from the president tonight?
Well, it's a good question. And I think in this politically correct culture, which we all inhabit, if you see something, say something, doesn't work very well because people are afraid, and understandably so. It would be good if the president could say, you know, we're not going to be so exquisitely sensitive to every single person's feelings that we are discouraging people from coming forward and reporting something that's worrisome to them. That would help a lot. I mean, if somebody has an apartment or a house that's, you know, there's a virtual armed camp, people who notice such things should not be afraid to report to the authorities and find out what it's all about. But that, I'm afraid, is where we are.
You know, as the president was on his initial discussion of this, treating it as another mass shooting, he raised the issue of gun control. And on Saturday in the New York Times, they ran a front page editorial for the first time since 1920 under the headline, "The Gun Epidemic." They write, "It is a moral outrage and a national disgrace that people can legally purchase weapons designed specifically to kill with brutal speed and efficiency. These are weapons of war." George, your thoughts?
Well, leaving aside the fact that some of us think the New York Times editorializes on its front page daily, and leaving aside the fact that the last time they did it was in June 1920 when they deplored the nomination of Warren G. Harding, who went on to win 60% of the popular vote. Leave that aside. When they talk about weapons of war, I think that most readers of that editorial, and perhaps the authors of it, think that the weapons in use here, what are called assault weapons, fire more than one bullet per pull of the trigger in a constant burst. Those are called machine guns. They've been illegal in this country since 1934. In fact, the American people have shown by voting at the polling booth for defenders of the Second Amendment, but also they have voted with their feet by going to gun stores, that what they want is control of their own guns. This year on Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, 185,000 Americans got background checks for firearms. That's a one-day record in this country. So the American people have made clear what they think about the Second Amendment and the usefulness of owning guns.
And this was before San Bernardino, we should point out. Juan, the fact is, when you talk about gun control, California has some of the toughest gun control laws in the nation, but law enforcement says that all of the guns, all of the ammunition that this couple assembled, and it was an arsenal, was all bought legally.
Well, in fact, it was bought legally. 2 were bought by friends, 2 not by the couple. So they had 4 guns in all. But the guns were modified, Chris, in such a way that allowed them to fire repeatedly, the so-called bullet button thing, where they can, instead of being able to do it manually, they just push a button and then they can reload so quickly. You know, in response to what George was saying, though, George, it's clear most Americans, including most gun owners, favor some kind of background checks for all purchases. And in California, they have almost universal background checks. But in this case, you're looking at a situation where these folks were able to amass so much in terms of the ammunition and guns, you know, without people understanding what they were doing, even their relatives. And I think that's troublesome to me. I'm troubled by the idea that even in the Senate last Thursday, they proposed what you heard the president mention in the soundbite, that people who are on a no-fly list shouldn't be able to buy guns. And the Senate couldn't deal with it. The Senate can't deal with background checks. Again, it's all bi-party. Republicans, I think, totally tied up with the NRA and the political support coming from the NRA, refuse to do anything about background checks.
You know, Brit, some would argue that this wasn't another mass shooting. This was a terrorist attack, and so therefore you shouldn't just judge it, as the president seemed to initially, like another Newtown or another shooting at a movie theater. Having said that, there was a fascinating debate over mass shootings that we saw this week. According to one definition, we have more than one mass shooting a day. There were 355 at San Bernardino. That's in 337 days. On the other hand, there's other analysis that says, if you look at it differently, that we are 8th in the world when it comes to this, behind such lawless countries as Norway and Belgium. So there seems, and in fact, by all measures, gun violence has gone down dramatically in this country.
That's the critical point here, that as gun ownership has blossomed and the Second Amendment seems to have collected more and more adherents, gun violence, overall gun violence, is down. And not only is that the case, it is also the case that the prescriptions for, quote, sensible gun control that are being advanced now in the wake of these shootings do not include anything that would have, as far as I know, that would have stopped this attack. So people are coming forward with unpopular solutions that have proved a dead end politically for the Democratic Party repeatedly, that wouldn't have solved the problem.
But don't you think that it's the case that in most states that have stricter gun controls have lower incidences of death, homicide by gun? There's some relationship there. And Chris, isn't it a relationship that the United States, among all Western industrialized countries, has this outstanding rate of murder by gun?
Well, actually, it turns out in terms of mass shootings, which is the specific thing we're talking about here, it doesn't. If you look at it per capita and you take out gang violence, well, it's a different deal.
I'm just saying.
If it's a different deal, we're behind Norway and Belgium. So it's not at all clear that there's a pattern here of such rampant gun violence.
I think if I'm dead, I don't care what the, the terrorist or the kid on the corner. I don't want to be dead.
All right, panel. I think we all agree we don't want to be dead. We have to take a break here. We'll see you all a little later.